All right, our next lecturer this afternoon is Dr. Walter Block, Loyola College in New Orleans, Senior Fellow of the Mises Institute, and he's going to be lecturing this afternoon on interventionism. Dr. Walter Block.
Thanks for the introduction, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here. In the past, what I've done when I've talked about interventionism, I sort of go every 3 years. 1 year I do minimum wage, next year I do free trade, and now it's interventionism in housing and land markets. And I'm going to stick in water because of the BP. Don't ask me why, but my excuse is that water is just fast-moving land, and land is slow-moving water, so it's all the same, and we apply the same principles. So I'll see if I can't stick that in. Under the rubric of housing and land markets, I'll cover rent control, zoning, public housing, and urban renewal. I was going to put in eminent domain and the ad colum doctrine, but I think I'll defer that to my Friday lecture where I talk about privatizing roads, streets, and highways. Then I'll talk a little bit about agricultural land reserve, farm subsidies, Henry George, and then the British petroleum difficulty. Okay, the first issue is rent control. And I did a book on rent control. I was the co-editor of this book on rent control, and I featured 2 quotes from very eminent economists. The first one is Gunnar Myrdal, who is a Swedish socialist, which is sort of a redundancy. My apologies to the Swedes, the 3 of them who are free enterprise. Gunnar Myrdal won the Nobel Prize with Hayek in '73. And he said, rent control is the worst exercise of central planning for governments lacking courage and vision. Now that's a pretty heavy indictment of rent control coming from a leftist, a credentialed leftist. Another one is Assar Lindbeck, who I think is now or was on the Nobel Prize committee to pick Nobel Prize winners, another Swedish socialist, who says next to bombing, rent control is the best way to destroy a city's housing. Now that's also a pretty heavy indictment of rent control. In this book, we had about 16 chapters, and what I did is I got a whole bunch of pictures from the newscasters of the day, some indicating bombing and others indicating the results of rent control. And what I did is I illustrated each of the chapters with one of these pictures, 8 of rent controlled and 8 of bombing, to see if I could fool the audience or fool the readers or fool myself after a while, because I couldn't figure out which was it, which either. First of all, I have a little confession. What I had to do is take out all pictures that would indicate whether it's from New York City, the main rent control place, or whether it was Dresden or Hiroshima or Nagasaki. So I had to get rid of all pictures that had a black person or an oriental-looking person, and I had to get rid of all that had the pagoda, the architectural style. And a further confession, bombing really is worse than rent control. So I took all the really bad bombing ones where you couldn't see any housing, it was just flat. I just threw them out. And then I threw out all of the minor damaged rent control. So I took the worst rent control and the least worst bombing ones. And then I said, to see the answer, go to page 320 or something like that. And after a while, after 6 months, I couldn't tell which was which either. So let me show you these pictures. So it says bomb damage or rent control, see page 320 for the answer. So that's one picture. That sort of looks like bombing. This one I think is rent control. You can tell the architecture of the South Bronx, New York City. I'm not sure which one that is. Hiroshima. That's a toughie because the South Bronx does look like that, or parts of it. So I think I've got 16 or 18 pictures. I'll flip through them. That's probably Japan. Germany, probably. Probably New York City, but look how crummy that is. That's pretty... See, I'm trying my best, but again, it is hard to come up with rent control that are worse than bombing. That looks like a bombing one. I'm not sure about this one. That's probably New York City. Is that it? Okay, so those are the pictures. I figured that a picture says 1,000 words or something, and it's a good way to illustrate just how devastating and how horrible rent control is. Now, the economics, Matthew Moran, call home or go to the desk. Rent control really is a disastrous issue. Before I get into rent control, I just wanted to say that there is this, how shall I say it, tension between Austrian economics and neoclassical economics. And the way I see it, you have the Austrian school, which is a Venn diagram overlap with the neoclassical school. And on some issues, we agree. There are issues like the Austrian business cycle, or monetary policy, things like that, or indifference, where there's a gigantic divergence between the two schools, where the Austrians have one view and then their guys have the other view. But then there is overlap in the middle where there is an agreement, by and large an agreement, although I'll try to indicate later that the agreement is not as agreeable as it could be. But on rent control, there is some sort of an agreement. And the analysis that both schools would use would be the ordinary supply and demand analysis, where if you push prices below the equilibrium level, you're going to get demand greater than supply, and you're going to have a shortage. The way rent control works is a little more complicated because they never peg rents below market rents. What they do is rather freeze it. They say, okay, whatever the rent is now, it's frozen. The landlord can't raise the rent. And then they rely upon inflation to increase the supply and demand curves in a vertical northern direction. So what you get is this divergence between supply and demand. So this is the analysis, the geometry of rent control. What you have is, I hope I didn't say anything wrong. The cops are against me. I've got more radical stuff to say than this. If they're going to cart me away, it's not going to be on rent control. Okay, so why is rent control advocated by the advocates of rent control? Well, one of them is to help poor tenants. And, we get out the violins and, the tiers and poor tenants, and they have to pay 30, 40, 50% of their income on rent, and this is a pity, so we want to help them. Well, there are problems with that. First of all, a basic element of economics is that if you want to help people, you're better off giving them money than a gift in kind. For example, which would you people rather have? $10,000 to spend on whatever you wanted, or products and services worth $10,000. For example, a bicycle, a violin, and a year's worth of Frisbees or something. Well, unless you were going to spend the $10,000 exactly on those things, you're much better off with the $10,000 because then you can spend it any way you want. So if you want to help people, don't lower their rents because that's a gift in kind. Rather, give them the money. Not that I say you should give them the money because, that there are problems with that. It's called theft if you take money from some people and give it to other people. But from their point of view, from the lefties' point of view who advocate rent control, you're better off giving them the money than giving them a gift in kind, which is a lower rent, where you have to stay in that apartment. So it's tied to occupancy. The only way you can get this gift is if you stay put in your apartment. But labor mobility then falls because people who otherwise would have moved to get a better job or a better school or a better this have an incentive not to go. In other words, it has to really be a much, much better job or a much better opportunity to get them to go because they have this rent control which sort of keeps them where they are. So productivity falls because labor mobility is decreased. New tenants have to pay bribes, key money to get these apartments when the apartments are pegged at below market rates. And then you have this phenomenon of very, very rich tenants who are protected by rent control. Mia Farrow, Woody Allen's former wife, has got some apartment worth, $10,000, $12,000 a month, and she pays $300 a month. Former Mayor Koch has an apartment. And then there's a listing of people who are very, very wealthy who are protected. And if you're supposed to be, if this is supposed to help the poor, well, what are these rich guys getting money for? Then it's unfair to landlords. Look, if you want to help tenants, why just pick on landlords? I mean, suppose we say there are poor people that don't have food. Well, should we pick on restaurants and supermarkets and let them help the poor? No, the presumption is that if you're going to help the poor, everyone should get in and chip in and help. But why single out just the group that's providing them with stuff already? So on an equity basis, even again from their point of view, not from a libertarian point of view, but from their point of view, it seems a bit hard to understand why this would be done. There are other problems with rent control beside the fact that it's an inefficient income transfer to the poor, which is the ostensible reason for this. One of them is you get shortages. You get less profit in residential rental units, less investment. It's like putting a yellow light or a red light in front of investment. If Aunt Tilly leaves you $1 million and the only thing that's controlled is residential rental units, are you going to put your money in residential rental units or are you going to put it in something else? The idea is, other things equal, if you were indifferent between putting it, so to speak, between putting it in residential units and somewhere else, and now we control this, well then the money will leave. People will try to get money out of that area, and new money won't flow into that area, it'll flow into other areas. So that's not a good thing. The idea is that if you want to help tenants and you want to lower rents, you have to look at the supply of housing. Anything that helps the supply of housing, increase the supply of housing, will push down rents. Anything that doesn't will not. Well, if you tell people we're going to regulate you, well, that's going to cut off supply, or at least some supply. Then you have deterioration. Landlords have less of an incentive and less money with which to make repairs. That's one of the reasons for the bombing or the rent-controlled out pictures of deterioration. The landlord has got no incentive to paint or to do plumbing or to make repairs or what have you. And they say, a stitch in time saves 9. So if you don't put in the repair money, the thing will deteriorate. Then what they do is these judges, what they'll do is they'll make an example of landlords who own property that isn't really good, high quality, and what they'll do is they'll make them live in the rent-controlled apartment, right next to all the tenants who hate them, who hate the landlords. Now I ask you, if you embarrass landlords in this way by making them live in their own semi or substandard housing, is this going to encourage investment is this going to encourage more people to become landlords or fewer? Well, obviously fewer, and the fewer the people that want to invest, well, the higher the rents, not the lower the rents. Then there's the issue of arson, which is one of the reasons that the South Bronx looks like the South Bronx. And the arson comes about from two sources. One, let's say you had a house, an apartment house, a 24-family apartment house, and let's say it was worth $1 million, and then rent control came, and now it's worth less, whereas you had insured it for $1 million, but now it's worth $500,000. Would you be happy or unhappy if a fire broke out and you collected your $1 million? You wouldn't be unhappy. And on the other hand, the New York City forces of housing decreed that in order to get into a new high-rise public housing unit, and this is the days before the public housing really went badly, you would get to the top of the list if your house burned down. So now we have an incentive from both sides. The landlord's happy, the tenants are happy, and amazing, it's just a coincidence that a lot of fires broke out, all because of these two governmental policies, and a little immorality on people who are setting fires, but still, government is indictable for these things, both from the landlord point of view and the tenant point of view. So there's less new building, even though, see now, what happens is new rent-controlled housing gets built. When they put in rent control, you're not going to start and build a new residential dwelling unit. You'd have to be crazy. You'd build a hotel. You'd build an office building. You'd build a condo. You'd build something else. The last thing you would do is build housing for tenants. So very little housing is getting done, even though they promise that they won't rent control new stuff. But they break their promises, as I'll indicate in a second. What happened was that the forces that be, the powers that be, the people in charge of housing in New York City, which I take as the example of rent control, under the old law, you could build on 60%, say this box, 60% of any land you could amass. And you had to leave something for lawns and sidewalks. And then they had this new idea that it should only be 40%. Because we need more lawns, we need more sidewalk, we need more amenities, whatever it is. The new rule is you can only build on 40% of any land you can amass. This is in the 80s. And they give you a 2-year grace period. If you can put in a foundation, you don't have to build the whole building, but if you just put in a foundation, you can get it in under the old 60% law, whereas in 2 years, you can only build in 40% of any land you can amass. So you can imagine that everyone, his uncle, was starting to build new housing to get in under this rule. And you had this gigantic surfeit or whatever, excessive amount of housing because of this law. And prices fell. Landlords were offering 6 months free rent, a year's free rent, very, very low leases. But then after this 2-year period, nobody ever built any more in New York City for a long time. And when those leases started to come due 3 years later, and no housing had been built in the interim, the rents started rising. And this was put down to unconscionable greed on the part of landlords, as if, landlords are greedier than anyone else. When people criticize capitalism for being greedy, I say, well, what about consumers? When you go shopping, don't you comparison shop for a TV or a refrigerator? Oh, but that's different. That's not greedy. Well, it's greed. The 80s was supposed to be the decade of greed. Come on, give me a break. People who are the same in the 80s as at any other time. They want to get the highest price for what they sell and the lowest price for what they buy. So, true to their promises, they didn't install rent control to stop this because the tenants were now complaining that the leases were getting double or triple. What they had was a thing called rent stabilization, which is sort of rent control under a different name. But this indicates that you can't trust them to keep their promises. Oh, I wanted to show you this. I forgot to show this before. Let me bring this up under the guise or under the rubric of the inefficiency of transfers. Suppose the market value of an apartment is $350. Can everyone see this? See how much better I am than Guido? You couldn't see his pictures. I can just push it up there a little. The market value of the apartment is $350. The rent-controlled rent is $200. It's easy to see what the landlord loses, but what does the tenant gain? And the answer is, ta-da, anything from $1 to $150. In other words, suppose you value the apartment at $205, you'll gain $5, right? Because you value it at $205 and you only have to pay $200. But the landlord loses $150. So it's a very inefficient income transfer where the guy from whom you're taking the money loses $150 and you only gain $5, or you could gain $1 and still take it. So that's one difficulty with this. Another difficulty has to do with racism. And where is Bob Murphy now that we need him to call people racists or something? If you haven't seen the zombie interview of Tom Woods, you must see this. This is, magnificent stuff. Harold Demsetz, what he did is he took a record of in Chicago, when there was no rent control up until World War II in 1941, what he did is he took the number of column inches of explicit racial advertisements for housing, like no blacks allowed, things like that. And you can see in the 3 years before, there were 1,000 column inches of this sort of stuff. And then rent control was instituted. In the first year, it went up by 70%. And then it went to triple, and then in 1945, sextuple, and then in 1946, nine-tuple, or 9.5-tuple, whatever that number would be. And then rent control was eliminated in Chicago and in many other cities, not New York City, but in Chicago. And all of a sudden, these racial ads started falling. And Dempsey says this is an indication that when prices are not allowed to ration goods, other things will ration goods. Namely, that the market is an anti-racist kind of enterprise. Now, according to the New York City law, every 2 years they're supposed to make a study to see if they should decontrol rent control. And by the way, the rent control that's now in operation in New York City in 2010 is a World War II emergency law. In other words, we're trying to stop an emergency that emanated from World War II. Now, I've got news for you. I'm not a historian, but Tom Woods will correct me if I'm wrong on this, but World War II took place a long time ago. What is this emergency from World War II going on here? And what it is that as long as the vacancy rate is low, that shows there's an emergency. But rent control keeps the vacancy rate low. So it's like a catch-22 situation. Now, who do they get to do these studies? They get sociologists. No respected or well-respecting or self-respecting economist would do a study like this to show that we need rent control. My apologies to the one or two sociologists, sort of like the Swedes. There might be one or two of them who are firm on these issues. By the way, they don't count abandoned units, as in the South Bronx, as in the housing stock, because if they did, the vacancy rate would be gigantic. But in other words, the fix is in. They're given a lot of bucks to perform a study, and the answer, we know what the answer is. The answer is we still need rent control, and the vacancy rate is too low to allow us to not have decontrol. Now, there is one good aspect of rent control, and I would be remiss in my duty if I didn't tell you about this, and that is that when you have rent control, property taxes go down because the value of real estate goes down. And the less money the government has, it's better, right? So this is a one good thing about rent control. The bad guys get less money. It's sort of a similar situation to drug legalization. Some people say, well, the good thing about drug legalization is that they'll be able to tax it and the government will have more money. In my view, that's the one reason we shouldn't legalize drugs. Namely, we favor legalization of drugs in spite of the fact that they'll have more money, not because of it. Then there's this whole business about Christmas. The law is you can evict a tenant for non-payment of rent, but they give you a month or a 2 or a 3 grace period. And if you start not paying your rent in September and October, by the time November comes around, the courts say, oh, well, it's almost Christmas. You can't put people out on the street in Christmas. So you get 3 or 4 or 5 months of non-payment of rent. Whereas the banks don't go to the landlord and say, oh, well, we understand, you can't pay your mortgage because you're not collecting rent. This is very strange. I mean, if you go shoplifting in a store around Christmas, they'll put you in jail. Whereas if you don't pay your rent, we can't be so hard-hearted as to throw people out on the street. Well, this is sort of rent control with a vengeance. I mean, here you get to not pay your rent for 3 or 4 months. That's a big chunk of, that's part of the reason why the market is so messed up. Mises said that you can't just stick with the level of regulations you've got. Either you've got to reduce them or you've got to increase them. And the example from rent control is they have to spread controls, because what the landlord wants to do is evict these tenants and make condos or co-ops or something, or convert it to a hotel, anything except getting Mia Farrow paying $300 a month for an apartment that's worth $12,000 a month. So you have to pass a law that you can't convert to condos. So you can see the spread of regulations a la von Mises. Then there's this little old lady phenomenon, I call it. The situation is, the fear is that if you get rid of rent control, rents will skyrocket. And even Hayek, in The Road to Serfdom, said, well, you have to phase out rent control. You can't get rid of it right away, which I think was a good book in some ways, but I have a critique written in the Journal of Libertarian Studies showing that Hayek is not as free enterprise as he could be. What the little old lady phenomenon is in the Upper West Side or a lot of places in New York City, you get these 12-room apartments with gigantic rooms. And in the 50s or 60s, you get a mother and a father with 8 kids, and they occupy the place, and it's a gigantic 5,000 square foot rental unit. And then one by one, the little kids all grow up and leave, and then the father dies. Now, I know this is sexist, and it's a little old lady, but the reality is that females have a life expectancy of 7 or 8 years more than males. That's why I'm picking on little old ladies instead of little old men. And little means because, gravity sort of shrinks you. I used to be a lot taller than I am now. So what you have is this little old lady whose kids have left and the husband has died, and now she's in this 12-room apartment, and she doesn't really need 12 rooms all for herself. Actually, she closes off 3 or 4 or 5 of them because it's too much of a hassle to clean them, and she just lives in 3 or 4 or 5 rooms. Well, once you get rid of rent control, and she's paying her $50 a month, and now the rents skyrocket, well, she has to leave. And it's as if all over the city you have 9 or 10 rooms being thrust onto the market that weren't there before. See, the reason people fear that when rent control gets decontrolled, the rents will skyrocket is because it takes 2 or 3 years to build a high-rise building. But what I'm saying here is that you get an almost instantaneous increase in the supply, which mitigates any tendency toward high rents because you have this extra supply coming on thanks to the little old lady effect. Okay, I did my PhD dissertation on rent control, and here's where we come to a little difference from our friends, the Neoclassicals. What I did was a econometric multiple regression equation where the main variable was B1, rent control, presence or absence of rent control, or how many years has a city had rent control, or how strict is the rent control. And the Y, the dependent variable, is things like quality of housing, deterioration, vacancy rates, things like that. In other words, what I'm trying to do is correlate presence of rent control with deterioration of housing. So I would expect a negative B1 variable. And I have to hold other things constant, like X2 would be income, X3 would, be a north-south dummy variable, or amount of crime, or something to indicate other sources of housing deterioration other than rent control and income. So I'm doing my dissertation, and most of the times I'm getting the correct sign for B1, and not only the correct sign, but I'm getting t-values at the 5%, 10%, and even sometimes at the 1 or 2% level, and everything is hunky-dory. But every once in a while, I come up with the wrong sign in my statistical calculations. And horrors, every once in a while, the wrong sign is statistically significant. Now, for the Austrians, we say, well, we're just illustrating this. We understand what the effects of rent control are. If you put a damper on prices, you're going to have less supply and everything's going to be screwed up. But for the Neoclassicals, what they're doing purportedly is testing this axiomatic apodictic principle. Look, if I take, you have a pen, I have a tie, and we trade. It must mean that you value the tie more than the pen. It must mean that I value the pen that I'm taking more than the tie. Otherwise, we wouldn't make the trade. Now, you might think that if you make the trade, you'll get an A. You don't realize I'm not marking you. Or you want to butter me up, or whatever the reason is. I don't know what's in your mind. All I know is that if you're willing to make the trade, you value this more than this. And if I'm willing to make the trade, I make the inverse valuation. Now, if you understand the English language, you understand that this is necessarily true. And if I came up with some statistical test of this and it didn't work, I wouldn't get rid of that theory. The theory goes on. So, my PhD dissertation advisor, Gary Becker, famous Nobel Prize winning neoclassical economist, if he were true to his crappy theory, he would say, oh, I've got this genius block who's going to overturn everything we know about rent control because one of his variables screwed up. He didn't say that. What he said, he was too polite to say it, but this is what he meant. He said, Block, go out and do it again until you get it right, you dummy. So, what's testing what? Is it the econometrics testing the theory, or is it the theory testing the econometrics? The neoclassicals say it's the econometrics testing the theory, and the Austrians say that's lunacy. All it is illustrating it. And some people are more amenable to statistical illustrations than others, and my approach with students is to hit them with both barrels. If you're trying to convert the heathen to the free enterprise, you use everything you can. And I use the theory and I use the statistics. But I don't think that the one is testing the other. Why is it that rent control is very popular in the people's republics of Santa Monica, Cambridge, New York City, Ann Arbor, San Francisco? Because there are thousands of students there. Students who are being miseducated. In one of my later lectures, I'll be talking about externalities and public goods. And the point I'll be making there is that this stuff is dead from the neck up. Because if you agree that rent control is bad and that students are supporting rent control because they're economically illiterate because of what they're being taught in school, instead of education being an external economy or a positive externality, it's a negative one. What we ought to do is tax schools instead of supporting them, a la Milton Friedman. Okay, enough about... one more thing about why is it so difficult to explain this to the public? Why is it that when you go back home to your parents, your siblings, your friends, they're going to think you're greedy or a fascist or racist or whatever it is for coming out against rent control? Well, one, housing has an inelastic supply curve. It takes a while for housing to adjust to price changes because it takes a while to build a 30-story house. Another is this idea of rent gouging. The way they portray the landlord in the newspapers is, he's got a big fat stomach and he's got a whip and a top hat and a money bags, and he comes and he says, the rent, the rent, the rent. He's always got a mustache, so you could tell he's a bad guy. And the other is this phenomenon that economics is all well and good to apply to, rubber bands or paper clips, but not to home and hearth. You can't apply economics to housing because, housing is where we live. Which is a little silly. It's sort of like, you go to medical school and you say, well, yes, you can apply the principles of medical school to everything, but not the heart. Because, the heart is, different. I'm not sure about this. Okay, enough about rent control. I now move on to zoning. My guru on this is a guy named Bernie Segan, recently departed, too early, friend of mine, who did a lot of work on Houston, Texas. Anyone from Houston, Texas here? Hey, we've got a few Houstonians. Was, for a while, the only major city that didn't have any zoning. I think they've caved in more recently, but for many years they didn't have any zoning. And Bernie Segan went around Houston. He wasn't from there, he was from California. He said, the city looks roughly like every other city. You don't have, filling stations on cul-de-sacs. You don't have cement factories downtown. You don't have pig farms in the middle of the city, even though you don't have any zoning preventing that. Now, what is zoning? Zoning is central planning applied to the geography. They put up a map on the city and they say, okay, in this area you can do this, in this area you can have housing, single-family housing, here you can have high-rise, here you can have this kind of industry, here you can have that kind of industry. In other words, it's central planning for the geography. And Bernie Segan says that central planning for the geography is roughly the equivalent of what Mises says central planning is for the economy. Namely, it just messes things up. Prices and profits are what determine. In other words, you can have market zoning. We're not against zoning. We're just against government zoning. Zoning is just the choice of what to put where in the geography. And you can have private zoning, profits and prices. That's why they have filling stations on the corner of two major arteries, because they want people to stop there. And if they put it in a cul-de-sac or a dead-end street, nobody's going to come there. And you'll go broke. So that's why you have zoning. Another example of zoning is in the shopping mall. They won't have two different bookstores. They won't have a McDonald's and a Burger King next to each other. So each one can, get the burger business, and they'll have 20 other different kinds of restaurants. Food fairs, the layout of department stores. They'll have the men's section, the women's section. I guess the transvestites have problems because of this, but too few transvestites, I guess. Another one is, what about the problem of your neighbor has a hippie pink and blue and polka dot house? How do you deal with that? You don't want to live next to it, but, he has a right to paint his house the way they want to. Well, you get condominium associations where they're very strict as to how you can paint your house and what kind of picket fence you can have, and some even insist that everyone has to have the same color curtains. And you might say, well, that's intrusive, but if you agree to it, then that's fine. Look, I used to play in an orchestra. I played the violin. I'm what's called a hit violinist. If you have a neighbor you hate, you hire me to play near his house. And every once in a while, and when I'd play a note, the conductor would go block, shape up, play the right note. But you know what he would do with the wind instruments? Anyone play a wind instrument? They make you breathe when it says so in the score. If you breathe in when you're supposed to breathe out, or out when you're supposed to breathe in, they stop the whole thing and say, you jerk, you trumpet player, breathe when I tell you to. Now, you can't be more intrusive than telling people when to breathe. Even the slave master didn't tell his slaves when to breathe. But as long as it's voluntary, it's unobjectionable. Well, so if you don't like these condominium associations where they tell you what color curtains you have to have, don't go there. But that's marketplace kind of zoning. Okay, the next one is public housing. Jane Jacobs is my guru on this. What Jane Jacobs teaches us is that the reason public housing is very, very bad is for two reasons. One, they have this inveterate hate of commerce. Most high-rises in the bottom story, there's a supermarket or a bar and grill or a place where you can buy a newspaper, some sort of commercial thing, which Jane Jacobs says keeps eyes on the street. And when eyes are on the street because people are going in and out, and then the yentas, that's Jewish old ladies who look out and say, they have something to look at, so they report crime, and there's less crime. But in the public housing, they don't allow any commerce. You want to go buy a grocery, you have to go 2 miles away. So that's one problem. The other problem that Jane Jacobs points out with public housing is that they have this idea that public housing should just be for the poor. So you have to have an income cutoff. If you make more than a certain amount of money, they won't let you in. And if you're in and you get a raise, they'll kick you out. So who is remaining there? Single female heads of households. Now again, I'm going to be accused of being a sexist, but the point is that you need adult males in the community in order to keep the teenage males at bay, because teenage males are, weird. They've got these things running through their bloodstream, and they go, blah, 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 and, they're just weird people. Exceptions in this room, of course. But there was this movie, Lord of the Flies, which was sort of a dystopia for 12-year-old boys. Well, public housing is a dystopia for 17-year-old boys. What you have is gangs of 17 or 16-year-old boys running the roost, and the female heads of households are powerless to stop them. There were the Spinks brothers, Leon and Michael Spinks, boxers of a decade ago. They lived in the Pruitt-Igoe housing in St. Louis. Anyone from St. Louis? So you probably know about this. The Pruitt-Igoe houses was like the jewel in the crown of public housing. There were maybe 50 buildings of 40, 50, and 60 stories. Public housing, just an immense thing. No commerce in the whole place. And they had to blow it up. And it wasn't, I guess it was terrorists, only there was government terrorists who decided to blow it up. They had to blow it up because they were just vertical slums. There were places where crime was rampant, where the people would use the elevators as toilets, and they used the staircases as toilets, and there was rapes and murders, and it was just impossible. So the the public housing people drew a very big lesson from this, and the lesson was vertical is bad. So now you have low-rise public housing with the same problem, but they just drew the wrong conclusion from the disarray going on there. I'm going to leave eminent domain and expropriation to another time when I talk about private roads. Let me talk a little bit about the agricultural land reserve. I spend part of the year in Vancouver, BC, Canada, and they have a thing called the agricultural land reserve. The idea is you have to buy foodstuffs locally, and by locally they mean 5 miles out of the town. So right cheek by jowl with very, very valuable Vancouver real estate, you got these farms. It's as if you still had farms in Manhattan. And the reason you don't have farms in Manhattan is because the produce of a farm isn't valuable enough to keep it as a farm. The alternative uses, a high-rise, hotel, office building, are much more powerful. So the natural order of things is to push agriculture away from the cities, and then you bring the stuff into the cities. But no, you have to have the agricultural land reserve. So you have these problems where land in agriculture is worth, I don't know what, 5,000, 10,000 an acre, whereas land in a big city is worth a lot more than 5,000 or 10,000 an acre. It's worth millions per acre. So you get a lot of graft where the legislature of British Columbia can convert a certain amount of land from agriculture use to other kind of use, and you get somebody, if the farmer can get this done, he stands to make zillions of dollars, so he goes to the legislature and tries to bribe people into allowing that. So you get these sorts of problems. The answer is to, just get rid of agricultural land reserve and let land be used in its most valuable purpose, and that's that. That's what we want to do with land, labor, and capital, is to allow them to flow to their most valuable uses so that we can have the biggest GDP possible. We can have more economic efficiency. If you artificially confine a certain amount of land to very low productive use, you're not going to be as rich as you were, and aren't we lefties supposed to be against poverty? Well, I guess there are things that are even more important than that, like buying local. The last point on the land business is Henry George. Henry George was very, very good on laissez-faire capitalism on everything except land. Land had to be socialized, run by the government. It's as if entrepreneurship stops at the border of land. You can have entrepreneurship for everything, and he understands the Misesian-Krusnerian analysis of entrepreneurship, how it brings about a better product, and Peter Klein has talked about that and will again. But somehow it doesn't apply to land, which is a little crazy, and Murray Rothbard has a very good critique of that. What Henry George wants to have is 100% tax on land, so that nobody has any incentive to make sure that the land goes to the people who can best use the land. Again, this is a constant refrain. If resources are not free to flow to the area where they can produce the most, well, we're going to be poorer than we could otherwise be, and what's the point of doing that? Okay, what I've done so far is given you interventionism on the land. I've gone over rent control. I've gone over public housing, gone over zoning, agricultural land reserve, Henry George. Now what I'm going to do is sort of sneak in the BP under the rubric that it's fast-moving land. It's just an excuse. I could have done more on this, but, BP is now in the news, and when I had planned to do this, it wasn't in the news. It just came about in April. Okay, the BP Deepwater Horizon rig disaster occurred on April 20th of this year. 11 rig workers died in this tragedy. And as a result, our friends on the left are taking our noses and trying to twist them. There's this article in the Wall Street Journal. That was supposed to be a joke. Not very funny, but it's sort of like, when a bear plays the violin and rides on a unicycle, you don't ask, is the bear on tune? You say, wow, a bear. on a unicycle playing the violin. Whoa. So when an economist tells a joke, you don't say, well, was it funny or not? You say, whoa, an economist told a joke. Whoa. So anyway, here we have, what's his name? Thomas Frank, writing in the Wall Street Journal. The title of his article on June 2nd was Laissez-faire meets the oil spill. It's an attempt to embarrass people who favor laissez-faire and say, see what you have when you have laissez-faire? I mean, as if the Gulf of Mexico is the prime example of laissez-faire, and there's been no regulation. It's been a pure It's very similar to, blaming the economic crisis, the meltdown that Tom Woods talks about in his book, or the 1932-31 depression on laissez-faire. It's as if we had laissez-faire in 28, or we had laissez-faire in 2006. It's a constant refrain. Whenever a problem occurs, the lefties will say, well, that's laissez-faire for you. Even though, we've got the Fed, we've got all sorts of regulatory bureaus, somehow it's laissez-faire's fault. Here's what he says. He says, quoting Thomas Frank, only a short while ago, of course, the populist right was riding high, sweeping the primaries and insisting that the operations of the market must not be interfered with, that government intervention of even the slightest kind dangerously diminishes human freedom. And where are we now, he goes on. Here's another quote from him. Back in April, for example, Rep. Ron Paul, Republican Texas, greeted the president's drilling policy with the suggestion that the Environmental Protection Agency be abolished and the energy market freed from bureaucrats so that it might answer to the demands of the people and the decisions of private investors. But what about the Tea Partiers today? Who will step forward now and demand that the energy market be rescued from regulatory bondage? Well, I guess here I am. I'm going to try to do that. I'm going to try to rescue the energy market from regulatory bondage, because there's been plenty of regulatory bondage. And the way I'll introduce this topic is I'll look at the before, the after, and then what is the solution. Okay, so what was happening before this tragedy occurred? What was happening before was that they weren't allowing drilling to occur in the Alaska Arctic National Wildlife Reserve, which is a vast area of Alaska where there's plenty of oil, and you don't get oil spills on the land, so it'd be safer to drill there. The oil sands in Alberta, a different way of getting oil from the sands. You sort of mine it like coal, and everyone is saying, oh, no, we have to boycott Canada because, this is environmentally incorrect. Then there's the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. This is a reserve set aside for petroleum drilling. And somebody once said, well, if you can't drill in the petroleum reserve, where can you drill? And then the other one is the shallow offshore of the Gulf of Mexico. Look, it's a lot easier to drill in 25 feet of water than in 1 mile of water, about 6,000 feet. And if there's a problem in 25 feet deep of water, it's a lot easier to solve than when the problem is a mile down. But the environmentalists were instrumental in making sure that you couldn't drill close to the shore, and you had to drill way out in the deep water, and so they all contributed to the problem, indirectly. Then there's one of my favorite regulatory bureaus, the Minerals Management Service, MMS. They were in the news before this problem, and anyone know what they were in the news for?
For partying and doing coke with the people they were regulating?
I heard pornography, but I'll accept... they go together, rock and roll and pornography and coke and stuff like that. That's what they were doing. They're supposed to be regulating these people, but they were in the news for porn and prostitution. And not that I'm against those things. I think they should be legal. But, if you're going to have a regulatory bureau doing that stuff on company time instead of regulating, and then you're going to complain that it's laissez-faire capitalism at work, that's a hard reach. They had this thing, a 582-page pamphlet or book called Regional Oil Spill Response Plan, Gulf of Mexico, that they imposed on BP and every other driller, and it doesn't even mention deep water oil spills. So here you have a regulatory bureau that has this 600-page thing. It doesn't anticipate this problem. These are the regulators. It reminds me of what happened with Katrina. FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers, between them, killed 1,500 people because of the dikes. It wasn't Katrina's fault. I mean, Katrina really missed us. It was the dikes sort of fell apart. And are FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers still in business? You're darn tootin' they are, because they're government regulatory bureaus. If they were private regulatory bureaus, that would be it for them. But they're governmental ones. Well, the MMS, I cannot tell a lie, the MMS is no longer. They've changed their name. See, regulation works. The MMS is gone. I was going to say capitalism works. No, regulation works. They're now called the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Regulation and Enforcement, or for short, the Bureau of Ocean Energy, BOE. It's sort of like an Ayn Rand novel where she keeps coming up with these bureaus to regulate the railroads or bureaus to regulate steel. I mean, that book was written in 1957, and it's really got this Deepwater Horizon rig disaster in its eyesight. Very much like public housing. Instead of learning about commerce and learning about income cutoffs, they think it's high-rises. No, changing it to the BOE isn't going to help anything. The number of inspectors was 60 to examine 4,000 facilities, which you think is a little too few if you're going to have good regulation. But in the last 20 years, the number of inspectors stayed the same at 60, and yet the deepwater wells rose 900%. Now, I'm not sure if I'm happy with this or unhappy with this. I noticed that in agriculture, it used to be that there were more farmers than members of the Department of Agriculture. And that sort of swapped. Now there are more regulators than farmers almost. So I'm not sure if I favor demanding a monopoly over regulation and keeping too few people in there or not. It's something we should think about. But the point is that what they're saying is this was an era of laissez-faire, but it wasn't an era of laissez-faire. This was a heavily regulated, or at least unheavily regulated thing by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Environmental Protection Agency, the MMS, the BOE, and left-wing environmental groups who are always out there trying to improve the world. Okay, that's the before picture. What's the after picture? The after picture, first on the list, is a thing called the Jones Act, as in Smith, Jones. What the Jones Act is a law that's been around for 100 years, which says that any commerce around our shores has to be in U.S.-owned boats with U.S. organized labor workers on those boats. And for some reason or another, the world's leading experts in cleaning up oily water are the Dutch. They're used to oil spills because they're dikes and stuff, and they've got technology that puts us into the shade. And I think now, finally, after a long, long while, your president and mine has allowed some help from the Dutch, who offered it very early. Again, very similar to the situation with Katrina, where all sorts of people came to help. They came with big boats full of staterooms for the homeless. They came with water and ice and orange juice and stuff, and they were turned back by FEMA. Well, the same thing has been occurring with the Obama administration in turning back help for the water. There's another rule, this rule called the 15 parts per million rule. This is the idea that it's illegal to dump into the Gulf of Mexico or any of the Mississippi River or anything like that, any water that has more than 15 parts per million impurities. Well, the Dutch ships can take water with, 500,000 impurities per million and regurgitate it and spew it out with 100 parts per million, which is very, very clean. But they're not allowed to, because of this rule. So what our very inefficient boats do is they scoop up the water, they go hundreds of miles away to dump it on land, and then they come back, and it's a very, very slow process. So it's as if they're purposely trying to make things worse by applying this and not saying, well, this 1,500 million rule, 15 part per million rule was okay in ordinary circumstances, but now we have an emergency, we have to temporarily disband it, or temporarily disband the Jones Act. No, these people have their principles. We've got to stick with this even if it screws up the environment. Then they have this thing, a moratorium on all drilling, which happily they've stopped. But as Bob Higgs makes clear, industrial accidents occur. If you want to build a high-rise, or you want to build a bridge or a road or a big farm or a mine, sometimes people get killed. You do the best you can, and under laissez-faire there would be a minimum of this because the incentives would be right and the information would be right. But just because some people die, you can't stop all of drilling. I mean, if you have a plane crash, does that mean we can't have planes anymore? If you have a car crash, no more cars? It's sort of very radical, but not very acceptable. Okay, what's the solution? The solution, as I see it, is privatize the Gulf of Mexico. Right now, the Gulf of Mexico is either owned by the government, the U.S. government, with a little help from the Mexican government, or it's unowned. And when it's unowned, you have the tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons is that you tend to overuse things. That's why the cow never came within 1 million miles of extinction, because it was privately owned. If you shot a cow today, you didn't have that cow tomorrow, so the cost of shooting the cow today was very high. Whereas the buffalo was unowned. If you shot a buffalo today, you didn't have it tomorrow anyway, so the cost of shooting it today were zero, so you might as well shoot it. So the buffalo were going extinct. The cow never came within 1 million miles of extinction. Well, you have a similar sort of a problem with the Gulf of Mexico. If the Gulf of Mexico is owned by the Gulf of Mexico Corporation, the Gulf of Mexico Corporation presumably would take more care with just this sort of a thing than an unowned situation. I mean, Obama, I don't even think, heard of or considered anything about the Gulf of Mexico before this problem occurred. Whereas if the Gulf of Mexico Corporation owned the Gulf of Mexico, it would eat, live, breathe, and sleep Gulf of Mexico situations, and it would presumably take better care of what it owned, and if it didn't, it would lose money and it would be bought out by somebody else. Not just having a name change as in the BOE for the MMS. Well, how would we do this? Well, ideally, according to Locke and Hoppe and Rothbard, what you do is you homestead the land or the water. The people who mix their labor with it get to be the owners of it. Now, this might be a little difficult to figure out who was using the Gulf of Mexico. Or when I was doing work with Lou Rockwell, he and I have 2 articles coming out on the Katrina situation. We were talking about privatizing the Mississippi River and putting the Mississippi River under the ownership of the Mississippi River Corporation. Well, it's a little hard to figure out who were the rightful owners of the Mississippi River. From a God's eye point of view, knowing full knowledge, we could tell exactly who used the Mississippi River, and those guys would own it in proportion to how much they used it. A substitute thing might be to take every person who lives within 5 miles of the Mississippi River and all those cities up and down the river, and anyone who has a boat or worked on there, and let's say there are 25 million people that I've just described. Well, you make a new corporation with 25 million shares, and you give it to them, and now they're the owners, and you can buy and sell shares in the Mississippi River. There's this joke, I'll sell you the Brooklyn Bridge. Well, for libertarians, buying a bridge is a reasonable thing, because if it's in the government's hands, it's going to be a mess up, and if it's in private hands, you'll have the ordinary structures of supply and demand and prices and profits. So one way to privatize the Gulf of Mexico is to take everyone all around Texas, Louisiana, Florida, Mexican cities, people who own boats and transport stuff around there, the people who've been digging mines and drilling for oil in the Gulf, and take those 25 million people, I'm just guessing at the numbers, and say, okay, you guys now own the Gulf of Mexico, and good luck to you. I think that would be the libertarian situation. I'm out of time. I hope you enjoyed this.